For everyone with an interest in MASH, or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up. Surfing the MASH Tsunami's annual year-end interviews with some of the people who made a difference in the mazeled world in 2023. Season 4, episode 50 plus starts now.
Today on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Could you pull a person with NASH off the street, if you will, ask them how their life has improved because of changes in the field? And I think, unfortunately, the answer to that is probably not. A potential drug got turned down, and now there's another one that's queued up, and we've got some optimism. And so that, at kind of face level, is a headline in and of itself. But dive into the weeds a little bit, and you look at why that happened and what happened, and why people are nervous or why people are optimistic. Wow, it just really has been a roller coaster ride, and that there hasn't been this sort of reliable predictability of due process.
I think it is time that we now bring in nurses to these Delphi processes. We are the patient's advocate. We are able to transcend and be in one space while debating regularly with doctors about the patient's view.
I think having a strong patient and or nurse voice in that can redefine about how the FDA thinks about safety. Is it pruritus why they're turning drugs down? As my boss Donna would say quite often, she doesn't know any liver patient that would rather die than itch.
If the people on the FDA AdCom cannot be involved with industry, therefore unbiased, in a situation where there are no approved drugs, then it basically means that if you haven't been on the development track, you don't know what's going on.
I'm being a bit of a homer when I say this, but I truly believe this, that patient advocacy organizations can be that voice. You know, we are the group that works with industry. We're the group that works with nurses. We work with providers in the field.
As a momentous year in steatotic liver disease comes to an end, the Surfing the MASH Tsunami team is reviewing the year with some of our favorite guests. Today, liver health advocate Louise Campbell and pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green interview Novo Nordisk International Medical Vice President Michelle Long on the value of collaboration and its impact on knowledge creation in 2023 and 2024 on the Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast.
Today we're here with our good friend Jeff McIntyre, who is at home in South Carolina wearing a Clemson Tiger jersey, reminding me of Prince of Tides and Kick It to Wingo Clemson, for those who know the reference. And Louise is with us, and Bjorn is still in the Saarland, working his way through his new responsibilities. So Jeff, how are you today?
I'm good. So always nice to be back in the South, and the pace is a little slower, and holidays are a little more festive. It's nice.
That all sounds pretty good to me. Slow pace, festive holidays. Louise is getting in the cars today or tomorrow morning to drive down?
Friday morning, but I'm back in London today.
So, Jeff, just to start with it, your basic warm-up question in a year review context, one good personal thing that happened in your year in 2023, personal being the key word.
To be fair, it has been a challenging year personally with the passing of my father in July. But I think if I would have to point to one good thing, it would be related to that, which was that he passed at 101 and change, and that it leading up to that and the time right after that was just this really wonderful celebration of his life, which bookmarked a really unique time in American and I think even world history. And being able to kind of learn from him about his experiences in everything from coming out of the Depression to playing Textile League baseball, which is not really a community that exists anymore in the U.S., to his time in World War II, and then coming out of the 50s and 60s and 70s with everything that was going on, and just being able to kind of really revel in the blessing that his life was, and think a lot about legacy and think about how we can live up to the things that our past generations have brought us to. It's really been, I know people usually full of a lot of grief and sadness, but I really just have felt like it's been an utter blessing to be able to get to know Dad at an older age, and then to be able to kind of bear witness through his eyes of the way that the world had changed and the way that the world changed him, and frankly has laid a foundation for me and those that I come into contact with. It's been truly a remarkable journey the past couple of months.
Is there any one particular path forward that you are selecting in your personal, professional, spiritual life, I don't really care which, take a pick, that has been created or profoundly affected by this experience?
I think it would just simply be walk the talk. That is something Dad would always do, is that talk is great. And he was definitely somebody that was a talker, always citing the big fish stories. But when at the end of the day, if there's not a result, if there's not something that you've done, then you probably haven't really accomplished a lot. One of Dad's sayings that would always tell me growing up is, how you spend your day is how you spend your life. And so I reflect back on that a lot in terms of trying to actually have something at the end of the day that's made a difference, and it doesn't just get sucked up with, emails and Zoom meetings and responses and stuff, but actually doing something that actually makes an impact, whether it's me getting out for a run or contacting an old friend or making sure that we get that deliverable taken care of at work. I think that's the big thing, and realizing that that's a generation, his generation was pre-television, and it's really hard for us to imagine in our day and age of doom scrolling and influencers the impact that actually getting out and getting your hands dirty and doing some of the work can have.
So he was born in 22?
22.
Yeah, my dad was born in 21. He's been gone almost 20 years now, but we had some of that at the end. The last few years, it's a pretty good experience.
It is.
And apropos of walk the talk, so now let's go to liver. 2023, thinking about the whole community and the whole field of fatty liver, right? When you think back on it, is there a particular phrase, word, vision that sums up the year for you well?
I've thought about this a bit, and perhaps contrary to some of the other folks you've spoken to, I would say that I think it is, the phrase that comes to mind is 2 steps back, 1 step forward, if you will. When I think back on 2023 and the calendar year, there are 2 distinct issues in NASH or in fatty liver disease that stand out. And that is drug approval and the drug approval process and nomenclature. And I feel like we have not quite gotten to where we need to be with this. I mean, certainly there's the story and there is the optimism. There is the optimism that the nomenclature will make a good, big, positive impact that will allow for things, and that there are drugs that are slated for, consideration. I think it's in March when the ruling is next year, that there is optimism around things. But I think if we take a look at 2023, kind of in the vacuum or compartmentalize it a little bit, I think there is as much to argue that we have had some insight on the processes and I want to say the man behind the curtain, but we'll say the people behind the curtain, that has revealed themselves to where we have a lot more work that we have to do. I was listening to either Brian Cox or Neil deGrasse Tyson the other day, and he was talking about how we don't know so much more than we used to. Back in the Greek days, well, Zeus is angry. That is why the volcano is erupting. We know that. But as we have built our knowledge and built our intelligence, we now don't know a lot more things. We don't know the relationships at an atomic level. We don't know molecular stuff. We don't know mysteries of the universe. And I think one of the things that this year has shown us, both in nomenclature and drug approval, is that there are processes behind the scenes which are really, really frustrating, and things that were really frustrating for patients. And frankly, at the end of the day, it's hard to say that here in the end of December that patients are better off because of a thing than they were at this time last year. And so a lot of process, a lot of machinations, but at the end of the day, are more patients being screened, diagnosed, and treated? Yeah, I think there's some of that, but are patients better off with NASH now than they were a year ago? Could you pull a person with NASH off the street, if you will, and ask them how their life has improved because of changes in the field? And I think, unfortunately, the answer to that is probably not.
You said 2 back and 1 up. Which are the 2 back, if it's specific, that have gotten us to a place where you say that about patients?
Well, the 2 back and the 1 up are actually similar, some of the same. I think the 2 back are the nomenclature discussion and the process and kind of everything that we've gone through with that. And then also the drug approval process. And so when I say these things, I talk not just about that they've announced a change, but I think we got to see for the first time kind of how the process is and how the process works with the medical societies, with an engagement with the patient community that was controversial at best. Drug approval, there is optimism. That's hopefully the optimism, I think, is our 1 step forward. But this was a year in which we had an ICER hearing for both the 2 drugs that were being considered at the time by ICER. And then we had the FDA hearing on that as well. And the FDA hearing was just breathtaking for those that actually watched it in terms of what the folks on the committee talked about, how they talked about people with NASH, how they talked about patients with liver disease. I was joking with someone the other day that I used to date somebody that when she and I would have kind of a fun discussion about something, and I would, in those rare instances, might actually have a point to make, and I might actually be correct. She would never admit it, and in poking fun at me, would say, I hear you, and I think I disagree with myself. And so it was always a little bit, it's not that you're right, it's that I disagree with myself. And I'll be damned if that's not what the FDA did with endpoints. If you listen to that whole discussion that they had on their endpoint approval, they went back and took a look at their endpoints and said, we see these endpoints. We know we gave you these endpoints. We know you've met endpoints. I think we disagree about what we decided. We disagree with ourselves about those endpoints. Boom, failure. And it was just remarkable to watch this sort of almost Escher-like folding on top of each other that only a government bureaucracy can do in terms of what their process was. And it's not that the drug or that the therapy got denied. It's that the process that it went through just raised all these questions suddenly of like, wow, can we trust what endpoints are going to be laid out from the FDA? Can we trust what is said? Can companies work in a transparent, willing way to move towards, good outcomes for patients? It was just, it was really kind of remarkable and breathtaking with them.
I recall having some of the same feelings as I watched that day. One of my feelings, frankly, was that if they had given clear communication to Intercept, which I think they probably had, then Intercept did not do a very good job of watching its sixth position, right? That the things that they ultimately were hit for were things that it made sense not to get approved for. Now, that doesn't disagree with what you're saying, by the way. Don't get me wrong, okay? Because, in fact, there were a couple of moments during that day where they asked questions. I said to myself, I wonder what this means for resmetirom. And the truth is, we don't know yet.
Yeah, and that we don't know yet, I think, is where the frustration is. And that's not kind of based on an administrative timeline or anything, but I don't think that there is confidence in that process by folks that are engaging it. And that's very different than whether it's approved or not. It's about whether there is a transparent and there is a responsible sort of process that drug development at the agency can go through. We've had great conversations with that department, and I think just when you get into this committee structure, for some reason, it seems to be scattered all over the place. I mean, at the end of one of those conversations where we had patients, GLI had all of our patients there. We were the only organization that had patients that were lined up to testify at that hearing, where you have somebody actually say, have you just considered losing weight? Represented such naivety and frankly such paternalism towards patients that it was really off-putting. And the fact that the process could get bogged down for approval based on that sort of engagement, it was just incredibly disheartening.
Yeah, my low point of the OCA hearing was some of the questions the chair was asking suggested the chair didn't believe that fatty liver is what we all know it to be or believe it to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Episode 12, way back when, since we're over 200 at this point, we had Brian Harvey with us, and we were talking about the first OCA letter. And his comment was, if you could go to cocktail parties with the regulatory people, they would all tell you they want to destroy conditional approval entirely. And everything I saw and heard over the next 3 years led me to be really skeptical that was the case, until I watched the OCA hearing.
I think this is where the news, the headline, if you will, within the liver field is that a drug got turned down, a potential drug got turned down, and now there's another one that's queued up, and we've got some optimism. And so that at kind of face level is a headline in of itself. But owing to the good nature of podcasts where we get to go dive into the weeds a little bit, and you look at why that happened and what happened and why people are nervous or why people are optimistic. Wow, it just really has been a roller coaster ride, and that there hasn't been this sort of reliable predictability of due process that we feel like we should be able to rely on from our government representatives in engaging this issue. And I don't point out anybody specifically at the FDA in this regard. I said we've had good conversations with them, but for some reason when OCA got into the hearing, it was just bananas.
I was just thinking, so remind me, OCA, it met both of the FDA endpoints.
The efficacy endpoints, it met one clearly, not the other, and safety, it never met what they asked for.
What I was thinking about was when we talk about safety, if we look at boceprevir and telaprevir, when they were first approved for hepatitis C, they weren't safe. They were just very, very well monitored. And any drug that has a safety profile issue, that can be supported. I think obviously the biggest concern is not meeting both endpoints. And I think resmetirom has met both endpoints and doesn't have the same safety concerns. So I think, yes, I'd agree with Jeff that we've moved forward in lots of ways. I'd probably be slightly more positive. Also, I commented to Michelle Long that I think it is time that we now bring in nurses to these Delphi processes. We are the patient's advocate. We are able to transcend and be in one space while debating regularly with doctors about the patient's view. And I think we work, and we're blessed within hepatology to have a lot of hepatologists who are very, very patient-focused and advocate very strongly, but their training and where they come from is a different mechanism. Having that additional strength at the table means that you naturally amplify the voice of the patient. And again, I think it is difficult when you put patients in a room and somebody's going to question them. We've already asked those questions of doctors. We've already said that's inappropriate language. We've already had that type of debate and conversation, so it comes into the patient interview or session when the doctors speak to them, because most nurses have had those conversations. Yeah, I think, yes, we've moved forward. Some things need to change, but I do get a sense, Jeff, there's a lot more momentum. There's a lot more momentum from the FDA to try and change those barriers. We are getting closer. And sometimes you have to go through painful processes to come out the outside with a better framework going forward.
I would totally agree with that. And our recent conversations with DHM would represent that as well. I think when you've had a process where you've had an asset that got turned down, for those that are in the pipeline, one of the things that I'm sure that they are doing is, well, let's take a look at this and see what are the lessons learned. You know, is it safety? Is it efficacy? What's going on? All of those things are in play here. And I don't mean to and I'm absolutely don't mean, and I'm not diminishing any of those aspects by which something profited or was turned back on. What I'm saying is, in line with you a little bit, Louise, is it's a little remarkable that one of the lessons learned here is that, wow, we really have to pay a lot more attention and do a lot more education with the FDA in terms of liver disease, liver patients, and how drug approval can impact. Even just the notion of safety. You know, I think having a strong patient and or nurse voice in that can redefine about how the FDA thinks about safety. Is it pruritus why they're turning drugs down? As my boss Donna would say quite often, she doesn't know any liver patient that would rather die than itch. And so, you know, we need to be able to have that voice represented in those conversations and in that decision-making process. And yeah, I do think that there is some cause for optimism there. Our recent conversations with DHN have been positive and enlightening and super helpful, I think, on both sides. But at the end of the day, you got to come back to that question of, are patients better today than they were this day last year due to the field and the process? Yeah, we can be optimistic and we can feel good about process and meetings. But at the end of the day, we still got patients with NASH that need treatment and services.
So I'll tell you one of the things that concerns me, and I've talked about the data points in some of these conversations, but not about the thrust. We go to AASLD, we go to liver meeting, and we learn that bariatric patients, in order to understand their fibrosis regression, the impact on fibrosis in terms of regression, 1 year is not the window, 5 years is the window. We then find out from presentation that Stephen Harrison did using histoindex data, and I had a conversation with Dean Tai about this offline, and in fact, an interview with Dean Tai is in this series talking about this thing, that when they run their analyses, they pretty consistently find about a 1/3 placebo success rate in everything they do. Now, by the way, in the case of resmetirom, in the study that Stephen presented, resmetirom had efficacy of about 55%. So you had the same roughly 22% spread that you'd be looking at otherwise. That's a slightly bigger spread than you would be looking at otherwise. But his point is that instead of having placebo results that are all over the place, if you take it through AI, you can get to a consistent pattern. And the science is only going to get better faster. And I think the regulatory processes militate against keeping up. It's bring me your data. And B, it's bring me your data against analytics and politics that are far more about risk avoidance. And that's institutional risk avoidance, not patient risk avoidance. If this is about patient risk avoidance, we'd be approving drugs. That's your comment about death versus itch. So the smarter we get about this disease, assuming that the agency wants to learn, will the gap spread to become a chasm, or will the advocates or the companies or somebody find a way to bring them along?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question that plays into a much larger picture. As, Louise mentioned, who's on the committees? Can we integrate nurses' voices? Can we integrate more patient voices in this? How do we get that in there? I think for years we've been doing this with non-invasives as well, of saying we can see it coming. We're not there yet, but if we're just patient and wait for the technology to come around, and it's just kind of this constant waiting game. And so as a patient advocate, we want to start pushing those buttons now. What's going to make the difference now for patients' lives? And for us, it's still education and awareness. It's getting people screened. It's trying to make sure that we've got great patient representation when there is an opportunity for things such as the public hearings, et cetera, but also being intentionally, assertive about this as well. GLI did the very first NASH externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. And so we've got to be able to look for those opportunities to be able to catch up. I do think the nomenclature debate, for good or bad, has allowed some more engagement in this, at least from the patient perspective it has. And so there may be some opportunities that come about as a result of that as well.
I'm listening to you and I'm realizing something that's truer here than it is in most places. If the people on the FDA AdCom cannot be involved with industry, therefore unbiased, in a situation where there are no approved drugs, then it basically means that if you haven't been on the development track, you don't know what's going on.
That is correct.
Which is how you get to questions like losing weight.
Yep.
And while I understand all the reasons, all the good government reasons that you wouldn't want people who work with industry on this committee, the net result is that you get to some of the questions and levels of naivete and everything else that we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in this instance, it very well may just be the devil that you have to dance with in this result, because I'm not sure how you go about putting industry advisors onto a government agency advisory board without there just being huge conflict that they have to kind of be able to wade through. I mean, ultimately, that would be a possible solution. But I would also urge, into this, and I'm being a bit of a homer when I say this, but I truly believe this, that patient advocacy organizations can be that voice. We are the group that works with industry. We're the group that works with nurses. We work with providers in the field. And I'm not convinced necessarily in the event of a optimistic outcome next year, even though I'm optimistic, but I'm not quite convinced yet, that we've answered all the questions around, say, patient access, for instance. And then what does it mean for next steps in that regard? We're still figuring out a little bit. We've gotten reassurances from the FDA that this is still going to live under hepatology, but with the new nomenclature, could there be some sort of movement that impacts the pipeline around the incorporation of metabolic states or metabolism as well? And so it's more of a play of we just need a lot more clarity in this regard. And I see industry as having a really important role, but as patients, it's similar to going to Capitol Hill, Roger. You can have industry show up and talk about what's happening and have legitimate concerns represented, but it's not going to make a difference until you have, be heard as loud, until you have a constituent from that district or that state show up. And that's what we've got to be able to do, is we've got to have better education efforts and awareness and better collaboration around the patient perspective on this.
So I believe that's right. But let me give you one of the pieces that comes out of the last comment I made. You wouldn't have that problem in oncology because so much oncology research is done and so much oncology research is distributed and so much basic science is known that anybody credible who would show up on an advisory board, even if they never work with industry, even if you can find someone who never works with industry, the baseline knowledge they're going to have is going to be robust enough to avoid a lot of the naive questions we were looking at. It could be that the only path out is through, and that means we've got to get things approved, however that happens, so that the discussion can get into the ozone and everybody, simply by breathing the air, starts to learn the lessons.
Well, we've all referred to when the first therapy gets approved that was going to be the brick removed from the wall that would allow the floodgates to pour forward of all these things. All these questions would then be answered at that point. And maybe that is the case. I think, unfortunately, we don't quite have the evidence base to be able to demonstrate that. But I totally agree with you on that. If you have someone with cancer or someone that's in the oncology field, they tend to have a higher level of representation in that regard. Maybe that's a lesson learned from us. I mean, that's or for us in that regard, how to talk about it.
No, I think, Jeff, you raised an interesting point about where this sits. We've now reclassified it as metabolic associated dysfunction. And I've previously been very open in the fact that I don't care whose crumbs of the table we eat at, as long as we find more liver disease and the right people. And if it has to go through an endocrine and cardiometabolic approval process, that may not be a bad thing, because we know that all-cause mortality from poor liver health is greater than just liver-related mortality. And it may be that you need a liver axis within endocrine care rather than liver fighting endocrine to get noticed. complicated, or you need a liver axis within cardiac care. So we reverse that argument. Our speciality sits within, because we have hepatologists that are endocrine specialists as well as hepatology, or cardio specialists, or rheumatology and do methotrexate. So it's not a far leap to move the approval processes for this to endocrine cardiology and meet the endpoints, because we are meeting endpoints in cardiology and endocrinology with these drugs and with resmetirom and semaglutide, obviously. So doing that's actually not a bad idea, and it'll be an interesting way, because we've opened that debate with the nomenclature as to where does it naturally sit.
Yeah, and to Roger's point, of that the only way is through, that I would agree with that, but I think that also, that's not a complacent position. It is a position by which we will fight and scratch and absolutely acknowledge every little injustice that happens along the way, to acknowledge that we do go through and we don't get continually held up by bureaucratic or nomenclature or whatever shenanigans happen along the way for that. And I agree, whoever, whatever comes to whoever's table we'll eat at, there's no question about that. But when we look back at the year, I think the thing that has been solidified is that we have, a lot more questions than we have the knowledge. We know a lot more about what we don't know now. Is it endocrine? Ken Kusi's done great stuff around the connection between diabetes and fatty liver disease, for instance. And so, yeah, we see the impact. You mentioned bariatric surgery, Roger. That's certainly a big thing. We see with the potential impact of obesity medications that there's a ton of possibilities out there, but there's also a ton of questions that come up with all of these. And all of them, the burden, unfortunately, falls on the individual patient at the end of the day.
And here's, to me, I listened to Louise and I said, in the perfect world, that's exactly right. In the world we live with, if you have to prove yourself superior to a gold standard in a specific situation, then everything to the outside doesn't matter. And that's the biggest concern. Now, in that regard, outcome studies, big long-term outcome studies could be our friends, because you start to look at what people die from with F2 and F3 fibrosis, and maybe you say, okay, fine, we've proven a significant enough benefit in terms of mortality or morbidity that we should think about this differently. But you're in the FDA, in the Myers-Briggs world, you're in a sensing judging environment. I want simple pieces of data that I can put in packets that give me one simple truth. And if I can't get that, then I've got to go back to find it. So I think what militates against being able to eat at anybody else's place on the table, at least for a while, is we're not going to lower A1C more than diabetes. We're not going to lower obesity more than some agents, except for the ones that are those agents. And I think it's telling in that regard that the people with the double and triple agonists didn't rush to NASH as an early indication, right? They went for other things faster.
And to truly drag this metaphor out as much as possible, I think there are too many tables to eat from right now on this. If you look at bariatric, you look at adult, or you look at the obesity medications, you look at, even just the range of diseases, disease states between F1 and F2 and cirrhosis, decompensated cirrhosis, acute liver failure. I mean, there are too many places. And I think this is, for me, I come back to nomenclature, where we could have had something very simply defined to move the field forward, to move from a negative to a positive, from non-alcoholic to metabolic. But in the context of everything else that's going on, one of my criticisms of that process has been, now we are burdened with a lot more complexity, where at the end of the day, we needed more simplicity. We needed something that we could rally around to be able to move forward, to be able then to coordinate all of these tables, to kind of have, regulatory, to be able to have diagnostic, to be able to have drug development, everybody kind of moving more in a similar direction. And the chip on my shoulder is that, once again, it's going to come down to patient organizations to be able to have to move that forward.
Yeah, and my only thought about that, to run around to the other side of whichever table you want to pick, is that the process you're describing would probably have militated against one of the things we all care about most, which is no reevaluation of products in the pipeline. It's hard for me to see, and I'm not as close to this as you are, but I'm not that far from it, that how you come up with the kind of simplifying, holistic definition you're talking about without affecting anything going through the pipeline. And that was the thing that nobody wanted to see happen. So, and they seem to have succeeded in that, right? I mean, it looks like if FDA and EMA have both said pretty clearly, we're going to treat all these changes terms as interchangeable, we're going to treat the patients as interchangeable.
I think there's the counterbalance here. Whilst I agree that it can be seen as more complicated from a sort of patient standpoint, from a medical and clinical side, it's clearer. We have clearer definitions for that categorization across steatotic liver disease. We particularly now have the category of MET-ALD, alcohol disease. And whilst I agree with Donna, that brings in a negative stereotype because we still used alcohol. However, we got rid of fat for steatosis. I think there is a clarity now across medicine and nursing that we can deal with. And when we put patients into those specific categories, it becomes clearer the conversation, it becomes clearer what we're dealing with, and there's a set definition. For us, it is more clear, and I can see why they went with that, and I can also see why it could be considered considerably more complicated. But I think one of the benefits that everybody has talked about is this new categorization and recognition that people drink alcohol. Does it impact? Does it not impact the disease? Is alcohol its own category? And I think, yes, from both of those sides, I can see why it is more complicated, but I can see from my side why it gives me more clarity.
That is an important distinction, I think. And foremost, Roger, I want to actually shout you out in this a little bit in allowing kind of the safe space to be able to have these conversations, which I think notably is something that has not and did not exist in a lot of the process. And so to be able to talk about this in a way that where we're kind of problem solving as opposed to agendas at stake really speaks testament to what you're doing with the show here.
Thank you.
I would say, Louise, to that I understand that. And I think I agree with you that from a diagnostic or from a clinical or from a practitioner standpoint, you've got more boxes to check, which allows for greater clarification because there's more detail to that. It's absolutely, I have no disagreement with that in any capacity. The place where I find that it's more complex then how does that trickle down? How does that impact the patient? And frankly, it is more complex and confusing. We've gone from NAFL to NASH. As I said, I feel like this process could have been let's just go from a negative to a positive. And that would have been enormous. That would have been a huge change that would have allowed us to be able to ask a lot of these questions about the nature of metabolic disease, about addressing alcohol in the midst of this, if we could have just made that switch. But what we've got now from a patient standpoint is we've gone from NAFL to NASH to MASLD, MASH, SLD, ALD, DILI, which is not a new thing, but it's included in this, MET-ALD, ALD, which is only based on 30 to 60 grams per day. Now we have also ALD with metabolic risk factors, which is over 60 grams as well, then other cryptogenic diseases and other combination etiologies. And that doesn't begin to include the changes that have happened as a result of this process in other countries where they now rely on MAFLD, such as in China and Australia and other countries in that region as well. And so for the patients, we've gone from something that could have been very, very confined and something that if the medical societies and the groups doing this had kind of run the traps on this, it could have been a more deliberate, more inclusive sort of process. And I don't mean to be crying over the milk in this instance, as much as to reflect that, wow, this is the challenge that we have in front of us now. As patients, that we've got to be able to now understand, if a patient comes in and says they've got SLD, MASLD, a chance for MASH with a touch of ALD, as opposed to just being told that they have NAFLD, well, that's something now we're going to have to walk through and figure out. As you say, Roger, the only way is through, but there is no denying that we have a much more complex and much more detailed sort of nomenclature to deal with. Granted, there's a benefit to it for the clinicians. For the patients, not as much in this regard, and it's really going to...
Jeff, I'm not even sure the benefit is for the clinicians. I think it's for the researchers, because the clinicians in hepatology, there's a benefit, but we're looking to primary care. We have 5 minutes before your heart stop at 2:00. So we're not going to get to talk a lot about 2024 because I'm going to share with you one more thought first, which came from Naeem Al-Khoury, who was talking about clinical care pathways. And he says, if we ask people to get all their diabetic patients screened, then primary care will send a third of their patients out to get screened. 80% will come back with don't worry about it. And 20% will get stolen by hepatology because they need a lot of hepatology care. And Naeem was asking, where in that structure is there, these are my words, not his, is there any positive reinforcement for primary care to play, right? That's the place where you would have wanted it to be simpler. But it wasn't done in the systems process. 4 minutes. Tell me about 2024. If we're doing this at the end of the year, what do you expect we'll be seeing? What do you hope we'll be seeing?
Well, we're hopeful for positive outcomes in terms of drug approval. No question about that. Due to the nomenclature, we have changed our International NASH Day to Fatty Liver Day, our Global Fatty Liver Day. We expect to have as much promise and much more expansive understanding as we expect some blowback from those that have too much agenda attached to the nomenclature process on that. We've already experienced that a little bit. And so we're hopeful in that way. I think what you're going to see is a lot more patient engagement and a lot more patient involvement in all of these processes. Unfortunately, the field in prior days kind of suffered from a lack of cohesive organization around that. And we're seeing that now. Through Global Fatty Liver Day, formerly NASH Day, we were able to screen GLI and our partner screened almost 70,000 patients for liver disease. And so programs are in place to have better communication with the regulatory agencies. And so I see it in these two places that I've designated as my 2 steps back as well, is what the future is we're going to be figuring these things out. Hopefully there's drug approval that goes along with the wacky process, and we'll continue to engage and push the buttons at the FDA and hopefully the EMA and other regulatory agencies down the road as well. And then the challenges that nomenclature has presented us, we now have to work out, which are things such as coding and, advertising in terms of clinical trials and trying to make sure that patients understand where they can go to be able to sign up for stuff. And so I think that's going to define it. And certainly if we have a therapy that is approved, that will jumpstart and hopefully hyper move those other aspects such as coding and search engines for clinical trials and those sort of things as well.
So that's a great answer. And we're now at 1:58, and you have to be off this thing in 90 seconds. So you get the last word. Well played. At any rate, look, we're looking forward to 2024. I think it's going to be a lot of exciting stuff going on. Jeff, happy holidays.
And now for the Season 4 End-of-Year Episodes Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. And also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. The last time I recorded a business section for this podcast, the U.S. Congress was delaying getting badly needed aid to Ukraine. The world was decrying the death of Palestinian civilians, while most were forgetting, and even worse, some were celebrating, the horrible rapes, beheadings, and other beastly crimes Hamas committed on innocent Israelis October 7th that precipitated the Israeli military action. I'd love to say that 3 weeks later, things have changed for the better, and there were days of hope in the Middle East during the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. But sadly, little is meaningfully improved. As we come to this holiday season, let's hope the Ukrainian military maintains and perseveres through the coming winter, and that we can find a solution in the Middle East that preserves an Israel that does not have to fear its neighbors and allows a Palestinian people who live next to them to find peace and prosperity and pursue a better quality of life for their families and themselves. Slava Ukraini, Am Yisrael Chai.
Congratulations, Yarn, and welcome back.
Last time we met, it was too soon to announce Professor Schottenberg's promotion to department head at the medical school in Saarland. Well, that's official now. Jorn has assumed his new responsibilities, and he will be with us on a more or less regular basis going forward. We may need to work a bit on how to improve his internet speed and reliability when staying overnight in Hamburg. I'm sure we'll work that out.
Hey, Spotify, thanks for the good news.
Last week, we received from Spotify their wrap-up numbers from 2023. What these numbers told us was that we had more growth this year than we had anticipated. 50% more listeners, 11% more streams, 72% of people listening doing so for the first time. And if we extrapolate up from Spotify's share of our entire listener pool, 3,000 listeners who rate us in their top 10 podcasts, 2,000 rating us in their top 5, and 750 rating us their overall top. Those are bigger numbers than we thought we had, and we're excited to know that so many people are getting benefit from this podcast.
You will see new graphics and a new email address when we all return in 2024.
In the interest of efficiency and recognition of Eric's increasingly demanding schedule, we decided to execute the entire graphic and website cutover to MASH Tsunami. All will be fixed when we come back in the beginning of the new year.
The vault is closed for 2023.
Historically, we've included neither Vault conversations nor business sections during the year-end interview series. No more Vault this year as well, but there are a few business section comments I want to share. These may change during the interview week or not. If they change, we'll let you know. And that's it for the year. I want to thank our team, Jorn, Louise, Jake, Mike, Eric, Steve, for their work throughout the year, and more important, to thank you, the listeners who stuck with us throughout. We've got more interviews ahead, and after that, we'll be back early in January with a new year of episodes and perhaps some new features as well. Until then, enjoy the holiday. Happy 2024, and as always, stay safe and surf on. Bye-bye now.
Join us tomorrow when our interview partner will be hepatoendocrinologist, SLD researcher, and key opinion leader, Professor Ken Kuzi.